It is so wonderful to see such a large audience and such a full house. Before I say a few words about the annual lecture, I would like to read the land acknowledgement. I understand this is a virtual gathering and hence the acknowledgement may not stand for all the different territories we reside in. As a member of York University community, I'm going to read the York's institutional acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This treaty is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our 12th annual lecture and our first virtual lecture actually. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to have Professor John Jackson Jr. deliver this year's lecture. As many of you may be aware, this lecture was originally scheduled for March 13th, 2020, and you know, the world has changed incredibly since. I'm truly grateful that John has so gracefully agreed to reschedule his lecture and deliver it in a different format. Thank you, John. While it is undoubtedly a loss that Professor Jackson is not able to present his lecture in person, there are a few important pluses of virtual gatherings and lectures. We obviously have a much larger audience, much greater than expected, and some very special guests who are able to attend sitting in different parts of the world. I know some of you are attending from New Delhi, India, and others are attending from Vancouver and all over the continent and beyond. Before I pass on the mic to others, I would like to say a few thank yous. First of all, a very big thank you to the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies for supporting the lecture. Thank you, and here is Ravi, who will be speaking brief in a minute. But before that, if I may ask you all to please unmute your mics for a minute. I want to extend a very hearty thank you to our incredible organizers, Catherine Denning and Elliot, who have worked doubly hard and taken care of all the details possible to make this event possible. Please join me in giving them a big round of applause. Last but not the least, please give it up for Colleen Robinson, who has made incredible arrangements, and please join me once again to thank Colleen. Thank you, Colleen, Catherine, and Danielle. And I would now like to invite our Associate Dean, Associate Dean, please, can we unmute? Can you mute now? Sorry. Associate Dean Research and Graduate Studies, Ravi DaCosta, to say a few words on behalf of the Faculty of Liberal Arts. Ravi.
Thank you, Shubhra. So on behalf of the University and the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, I'd like to thank you all for coming, or rather joining this event, especially those of you who are from outside of Toronto and Canada. Welcome. This is a very important event for the Department of Anthropology undergraduate program in social anthropology, where many of our graduate students are. But as is clear from the extraordinary turnout, it's also of great interest for many others in the faculty and university. The many scholars, both faculty and students, who use ethnography in their work and theorize it. This is an exceptionally dynamic and creative approach, exemplified by the work of groups like the Centre for Experimental Ethnography, of which John's a member, and the Centre for Imaginative Ethnography, of which Danielle is a founding member. Uh, and like many other institutions, we are currently embarked on efforts to try to address the problem of anti-Black racism in the university, in our teaching and research, and the way we are organised and work together. Today's lecture, given by a most prolific and innovative scholar, filmmaker, and academic leader, therefore couldn't be more timely. So I'd like to welcome to York John L. Jackson, Jr. John is the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and the Richard Perry University Professor at the William Penn University of Pennsylvania. Welcome. We're looking forward to your lecture. Thanks all for coming.
Thank you so much, Ravi. So I'm Catherine Denning. I'm an associate prof in anthropology. And for anybody who's just joining us now, who's a latecomer, welcome to our annual lecture in anthropology. And after our guest speaker, we're going to have some discussion with some audience input welcomed via chat. Also, we are currently recording the talk, but we won't be recording the question period. So it's been such a pleasure to co-organize this event. John, again, like everybody else, I'm just so grateful that you can join us virtually. And we really, really, really hope to host you properly at York one day when we aren't in the midst of the pandemic. It was heartbreaking to have to cancel the event in March, but I'm so glad you're here with us now. So as you've just heard, John is the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School of Communication with a background in communication, so a BA in radio and TV and film from Howard University, and then his PhD in anthropology from Columbia. And he was at Duke and at Harvard before moving to the University of Pennsylvania. As you know, I mean, you're here to hear him, but I'm just going to reiterate. So his research examines ethnographic methods in media analysis, the impact of mass media on urban life, media making as a form of community building and knowledge production, globalization, and the remaking of ethnic and racial diasporas, visual studies, urban anthropology, critical race theory, and ethnographic film. So he also critically explores how film and other non-traditional or multimodal formats can be effectively utilized in scholarly projects. And I'm looking forward to hearing all about the Collective for Advancing Multimodal Research Arts, which fosters interdisciplinary collaborations between scholars, sensory ethnographers, artists, and educators, and also about the Center for Experimental Ethnography. Dean Jackson has written many books, including Harlem World, Real Black, Racial Paranoia, Thin Description, and Impolite Conversations, Televised Redemption, and he's also the editor of Social Policy and Social Justice. And on the multimodal front, with his colleague Deborah Thomas, he has co-directed Bad Friday, and also I'm hoping he's going to tell us all about the film Making Sweet Tea, Lives and Loves of Southern Black Gay Men, which has been winning a lot of awards this year, as it's been doing the documentary film festivals. So here is Dean and Professor John L. Jackson Jr. to tell us about what a difference filmmaking makes, autoethnography, multimodality, and the future of scholarship.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. I want to thank you and Danielle for the invitation. I'm actually doing this a little bit under duress. I really wish I were there. This is an impossible scenario, but the kind of work you all are doing at York is so valuable, I think, so important that I thought we should at least start the conversation virtually, but we will continue it in other ways too. So thank you all for the invitation to speak at the annual lecture. I want to thank the Associate Dean and the Chair for their wonderful words to start the event. I wasn't planning to talk much about sweet tea, but we'll see how it goes. I always tell people I've been committed to preparing for talks, but not reading them, which isn't a very kind of anthropological thing to do. We tend to read our papers. But one of the reasons why I do that is because when I was a high school student, I got this crazy idea in my head that I would, for a career, be a professional stand-up comedian. Now, I wasn't funny then, I'm not funny now, but I thought it was the coolest job you could imagine. Like, what could be better than that, than making people laugh and getting paid to do it? And so I would sneak out of the house in high school. I lived in Brooklyn, New York, and way down in southern Brooklyn, for folks who know New York City, it felt like a light year away from Manhattan, where the comedy clubs were. But I would sneak out of the house and go to Manhattan and work on my sets. and they were terrible, right? But I was a high school kid. I'd go on sometimes midnight, 1 in the morning. And if I don't have any evidence, thankfully, of these late night escapades, but if I had them, you'd hear all of this really painful laughter for folks who really didn't want to burst the dreams of an unfunny teenage kid in New York City. And I never became really good at comedy, but the one thing I feel like I pulled from those experiences was I learned how to be in a room with a crowd and try to read the crowd. And that's one of the things you can't do as well virtually. Almost can't do it at all, I would say. And so I want to apologize for the fact that I feel the kind of way in which I like to talk to folks means I try to make it a give and take, a back and forth between me and the audience. And we'll see if we can pull some of that off. I'll try to kind of look at the gallery and see if people are getting me, and if they're not, try to use that as evidence or data to try to help me kind of course correct a little bit. I do want to say, for the last year and a half, I've been dean of the Annenberg School at Penn, which has allowed me to do, I think, incredible multimodal work. It started before I became dean, but now there's a different kind of way I can help institutionalize this work at Penn, which we can talk about a little bit. But before I got back to Annenberg, because I was there a few years ago, for 4.5 years before I returned to Annenberg, I was dean of Penn School of Social Policy and Practice. We call it Penn Social Justice School. And there were many exciting things about that, but one of the things it allowed me to do as an urban anthropologist was to be reconnected to the city of Philadelphia. So even though I do urban ethnographic research, my field site hasn't been Philadelphia. So I was one of these academics who lived in Philly, but I didn't know Philadelphia in the way in which an urban ethnographer would want to know the urban community he resided in. And so going to the School of Social Policy and Practice, where all of our students are fanned out into the community doing amazing work, allowed me to develop different kinds of connections to the folks who are trying to make Philadelphia a fairer, a more equitable city. And that for me was re-energizing. So I loved doing that work and did it for 4.5 years before coming back to Annenberg. And we're going to talk about why I even decided to come back to Annenberg, if that is something people are interested in. But actually, I want to go before the time I spent at the School of Social Policy Practice, when I spent about 2 years or so as the senior advisor to the provost at the university on diversity. And this was a role we had never had before. So I was the inaugural special advisor to the provost on diversity. And that's a job that's one of these positions where you're in the room a lot of the time when the decisions are made, but you don't have any real power to make the decision. You have the power of persuasion, right? And you have the information, but you're not the shot caller. You're not the one that decides, yes, we're doing this, no, we're not, right? Sometimes you win some arguments, sometimes you don't. But I bring it up because one of the things, I've learned so many things during those 2 years about what diversity looks like at elite academic institutions. Maybe the thing I always grab onto when people ask me about kind of what I've continued to remind myself about that experience, and it's maybe gonna be something that seems self-evident to you all, but diversity is one of these ideas. I'll tell you 2 things I learned. First, diversity is one of these ideas that everyone can rally behind, almost unequivocally, at 50,000 feet in the air, right? You keep it abstract, keep it light and ethereal, we're all on board. But once you try to drag that concept down to the bricks and mortar of everyday life, to policies and practices on campus, you start to see the fissures in that collective solidarity. You start to realize why it becomes so difficult for institutions to go from talking the talk around this stuff to walking the walk. But the second thing I learned, which is really what I want to sort of pivot to and use as a jumping off point for the talk today, is that honestly, in a lot of ways, once you're leading with the language of diversity, once you've started the conversation about inclusion, about equity, with an invocation of diversity, most of the time, it means you've already lost that argument. Once you're invoking diversity, it's almost like this rhetoric of desperation, I would argue. And so part of what I think about when I try to narrate my own career are other ways in which we can try to figure out mechanisms, techniques, processes, and practices that actually allow us to institutionalize an inclusive perspective that doesn't rely simply on the rhetoric and language of aspiration, right? Not leading with the notion of the concept of diversity, but how do you make the world diverse? And so the way I'd start is by saying, I never imagined I would ever be an academic. My parents aren't academics. I didn't know anything about the academy. I was, as an undergraduate at Howard University, brainwashed. That's what happened. And I was on a track to go to Hollywood. I was going to go to LA. All my friends were going to LA. I'm a film major. I knew how to make movies. Howard at the time did something I know they don't do now, which is if you were an undergraduate and had an idea for a film, they were paying for processing, because we were actually still making film then. Now we say film and we don't mean film, we mean digital video. But back then, not that long ago, we were still changing magazines in a black bag, sending what we shot off to a lab, hoping we got the right exposure, and then editing quite decidedly linearly on a Steenbeck, right? This was the world I was trying, and I learned to love filmmaking. And so I was gonna go out to LA. And the only reason, one summer, I decided to take part in one of these 8-week, they called it grad prep. But really it was an attempt to get students of color especially to consider getting PhDs. Now, the only thing that attracted me to that program at the time was it was based in DC, and I didn't want to go back to New York because I would probably just have to spend the summer working at McDonald's or Burger King or something. So I figured I'd stay in DC. They'd pay me to do that. But also, I'd be able to find a way to work on some of my own projects because I was doing a lot of filmmaking in DC. So that's what I did. And they spent the summer basically plying us with tons of resources, flying in all these academics from different fields in the social sciences and humanities and even the natural sciences. And all of these folks were telling us that the academy needs more people of color. Again, they were leading with diversity, but it was the first moment I realized that if I actually wanted to get a PhD, I might not necessarily have to pay for it. I didn't even realize that. And so I thought I liked school well enough. I was doing pretty well at Howard, and I knew technically how to make films. But other than those little jaunts off to do stand-up comedy as a high school student in New York, I felt like I didn't know enough about the world. And so I thought, well, maybe I can have my cake and eat it too. Maybe I'll always be a filmmaker. I know how to make films, but I could separate myself from everyone else trying to make movies out in LA by developing a way of telling stories that was conscious of all the different kinds of cultural worlds out there, and maybe even the different forms storytelling can take. So as an undergraduate, I decided I was going to be a filmmaker and I was going to get a PhD. And that was going to be something that would inform my storytelling. I think it sounds very naive, but I think it was plausible enough, right? That's what I figured. And so at that point, I had to figure out what discipline would allow me to do that. And at that point, going through the card catalog, talking to the librarians, I learned that there was this history of ethnographic filmmaking, this long tradition of anthropologists trying to make sense of, trying to represent cultural difference in images and sound. And so I said, wow, like, let me watch some of these films. Let me think about whether or not this is kind of what I had in my head when I imagined I'd put these things together. And it seemed like, you know what, this is a reasonable enough thing to try. So I said, you know what, I'm gonna apply to anthropology programs. I'm gonna tell them I wanna make ethnographic films. So I wrote, my statements were these 3-page manifestos on the power of ethnographic film. Now, mind you, at this point, I had taken no anthropology courses at all. I knew nothing about anthropology. So I had to cram all I could, both curricularly and extracurricularly, into the final 2 semesters I had at Howard. And I did that. I mean, I was all in. This was gonna be my game plan now. No more stand-up comedy. It was gonna be ethnographic film. And I applied to really only 3 places, all up in New York City, because I wanted to go back home at that point. And I only got into, of course, I was lucky I got into any programs. Because again, I didn't know anything about anthropology, really. I knew film, and I led with this idea of film. And it just so happened, unbeknownst to me, that Columbia was hiring a brand new faculty member who was to start that following fall, right, when the incoming class would begin, whose specialty was film and anthropology. So they were like, we have this kooky applicant who wants to do film. We have this professor coming in whose specialty is film. We'll put them together. If they had not hired that person, I guarantee you, I wouldn't have gotten into Columbia either. I used to tell people, I'm pretty confident I would have been the person who directed the Black Panther movie if that had been the case, but that's neither here nor there. That's a different world. We don't have to go to, but I got it. And within 5 seconds, almost literally, of getting into the door, Skirmahorn Extension on Columbia's campus, it was clear to me the faculty did not want me to pick up another film camera until I got tenure somewhere. Because that's not what academics did, right? I had to write, right? So the filmmaking got me in, but their game plan was you put the film to the side, or at least as I read it. And I don't think I was just making this up. You know, first things first, right? Learn classic social theory, learn contemporary theory, learn anthropological history of methods, learn how to write like an academician. And once you get tenure, then you can start making movies again. And this wasn't something just I heard. One of my colleagues, Carolyn Rouse, who's a fantastic anthropologist at Princeton, basically got a version of the same thing, right? So this is someone, and I felt like she even, she studied out on the West Coast, which was sexier, right? And she studied at the graduate level in film. And she was also getting these cues from people that if she was going to be taken seriously as an anthropologist, she'd have to hold off on the filmmaking, right? Wait till after tenure. I've always been pretty stubborn. And so I decided I was going to keep making movies, right? Because that's what I love to do. But I would just do that filmmaking as a graduate student under the cover of darkness. So I wouldn't tell my advisor, I wouldn't tell other members of the committee. I'd make all of my grad student colleagues and peers swear to secrecy. Because I figured if the faculty found out, they'd say, well, maybe he'd be a good enough academic if he really wanted to do it, but he must not want to do it, right? Because if he did, he wouldn't be doing these weird films. And at this point, it was these hybrid films that are part fiction, part nonfiction. We were making the transition from film, right, cinema, to photochemical processes to digital video, right? So I had to learn this entirely new format and was doing it as a grad student while taking courses and finishing up. But it was still a different track. And so when I defended the dissertation, which had nothing really to do with film, although it's not completely true, and defended it, got my degree, in a sense, I came out to my advisor by showing all these films I'd made. Feature films, short films, fiction, nonfiction, and then went off to a postdoc, 3-year postdoc, where I spent all of that time basically trying to figure out my own idiosyncratic version of being an ethnographic filmmaker. So a lot of experimenting, a lot of work on films that I hoped no one would ever see, because it was me developing my craft, developing my approach, developing my voice as a filmmaker. I didn't know the ways in which thinking like an anthropologist was going to change my approach to the screen, my assumptions about what kinds of messages are embedded in visual stories. And so I spent 3 years doing that work before I ended up taking the first job of mine, which was teaching anthropology and teaching film at Duke University in the Cultural Anthropology Department and in the Center for Documentary Studies up there. And for me, what was really powerful about that moment, it was the first time I had to take what was in my head as, really idiolectic and odd visual anthropologist, and try to get students to appreciate the value added for anthropology students and others by doing this work with a serious commitment to the difference that images and sound might make. And the thing that stands out to me about that moment is it was then that I started to try to teach with film. And there was one film, and it's a version of, I think, what's going to be a theme you'll hear a few more times before I end. There's a film I taught every semester. I got to Duke in 2002. So every semester I was there that I taught a film class. Taught a film called The Cruise, which is about this really frenetic New York tour guide. And the film is interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, but what made it particularly poignant for us, thinking through the power, the daunting power, the unexpected ways in which stories can change after you've made them as a filmmaker, is it ends with this, the main character, who is clearly one of the most masterful and well-versed and bizarre tour guides you would ever meet in any city. Standing, and he's railing against corporate America. He's talking about all the ways in which New York is complicit in sort of global capital. And he's standing in the middle of the World Trade Center towers. And they're spinning around, and it's incredibly powerful, moving camera. And in 2002, we're still getting over the fact that the World Trade Center is no longer there, right? So it's almost traumatic to see the film in 2002 and 2003 and 2004, because we're still so close to the actual incident. And so what it brought home to the students, and it's a version, I think, of one of the reasons why, and it's not the only reason, but I think it's one of the reasons why we become so fearful of what film represents in an academic context, is you realize, even though you imagine you're telling a story that's in your control as the filmmaker, the way the social world around you is transformed can actually fundamentally remake what that film, what that project represents. And so there's a version, I think, of what we had to deal with every time the students worked through that film, that to me, I keep going back to when I try to make sense of, and this is my sort of overarching question, and it's been the question since I got to Penn in 2006, which is, why is the Academy in certain ways, I would say, hostile to, I would say afraid of, the difference that making films has on what scholarship entails. And so if there's a fundamental way to describe what I feel like my project is, it's really about trying to redefine what intellectual activity entails, what forms they take. It's only contingencies of history that allow us to imagine that only journal articles or books can be the currency of the realm in the Academy. Everything you can do in a journal article or in a book manuscript, you can do with film. And we actually tried to do some of that when we initially began some of the projects we were doing at Penn. But the point I want to bring home now is, I was invested in trying to figure out how to get the Academy to open up enough to let folks come in and make movies, not as another form of public intellectualism, which is great. I mean, there's nothing wrong with public scholarship, but as another way of speaking to other colleagues within the Academy, right? As another way of doing scholarship with no adjectival difference. And so once I left Duke and got to Penn, that was a version of my main project. And it started at a time when I was just beginning to do my work with the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. And this is a group, for folks who don't know them, that really comes out of a community of African Americans all across the US, but based in Chicago when they left in the 60s, who emigrated first to West Africa, and then eventually from 67 to 69, they made their way to what they re-geographize as Northeast Africa, which you would know as the modern state of Israel, where they've been ever since. And what was originally, somewhere around 400 African Americans is now closer to 5,000, right? With easily over 1,500 births in Israel alone. And this is a 4-continent-wide spiritual community that is incredibly savvy at using new media, including filmmaking, to connect all the different corners of their transnational spiritual community and to tell their own stories about their journey, about their beliefs and about all the ways in which they imagine their project to be a project for them that's about saving the planet Earth. And I bring that up because as I'm moving from Duke to Penn, I'm starting this project with the Hebrew Israelites, who are rabid filmmakers. They're both rabid filmmakers and film archivists. And so they were probably, they've been able to make the headlines a few different times over the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And one of the moments was when Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown went and visited the community. And the first time I visited their kifar, their village in Dimona in southern Israel, I probably spent, I don't know, maybe 6 hours just in their media center watching the footage they themselves shot of those two visiting with them throughout the countryside of Israel. And I bring that up partly because there's an irony there. Because as I was working with a community that had such a prolific investment in filmmaking, such a really serious commitment to the power they could deploy this technology to do vis-a-vis getting their story out about the world and documenting their interactions with the world. And there are tons to say about how they do that documentary work. I had decided I was never, in the talks I would give on the community, I wasn't showing anything about their work. So I wasn't showing any of my own, and I was taking a little bit of video footage. Wasn't showing any of their own video footage, partly because I felt like there was a version of their performance of race and religion that cut against the grain of so many people's assumptions about Black spirituality, about what race and religion look like, that I didn't have the time, I thought, to educate audiences about how to watch these images. And I didn't trust the audience. I didn't trust what they would do with the images of them in their annual Passover festivals. I didn't trust what they would do with their sort of self-representation, the very self-conscious reconceptualizations of their everyday cultural life. So I decided, instead of going down that road, I wasn't going to show anything. So I talked about the group, but I withheld the images. And I think if you speak to a lot of different kind of anthropologists, there are a lot of versions of that sort of story. And I remember at the time, we were starting to work with PhD students at Penn who were interested in incorporating film into their research, mostly anthropology students, but also in education. We had some students in Africana studies and other places. And we had read this short piece, I'm not even sure people are reading it anymore, by Wilton Martinez called, I can't remember what journal it was in, but it's called Who Constructs Anthropological Knowledge? And other people might read the article differently, but the way I read it was as a very depressing articulation of how impossible it is, or at least how difficult it is, to get students, especially, and by extension, any viewer, to unlearn their xenophobic and racist views when watching a film, right? So part of the backdrop for this study is, let's give students the tools they need to be self-conscious and critical viewers of cultural difference. Let's give them a history of kind of postmodern critiques of xenophobic perspectives and see if that changes the way they engage any of these anthropological films. And what he argues, at least my gloss on it, I think it's not indefensible, is that really, even with all the best intentions, even with all the ammunition of anthropological theories about how we reproduce marginalization and demonization, the students get caught up in the very same techniques for othering. And so I'm reading this, we're starting to think about how do we teach PhD students, and I just didn't feel like I had the time, the energy, maybe even the ability to educate audiences enough to make sense of that film. So to make sense of the filmmaking work that the Black Hebrews were doing. And so I left that alone and decided, though, that I would work with these PhD students, about 25 in the first cohort or so, who wanted to do this work. And at first, what we decided was we're going to spend a semester doing ethnographic film. And most of these students, probably 23 of them, had not picked up a camera before at all. And one of the things we decided was, from the very first class session, they were going to work in film, right? So they would respond to films, respond to readings every week. The responses had to be visual responses. It could just be you in front of the camera. It didn't have to be any fancy editing. But from week one, you had to pick up a camera. And we spent that whole semester getting them to just routinize their investment in their own capacity to deploy that tool the same way they pick up a pencil or turn on a computer. And so by the end of that semester, they had started to feel comfortable in articulating what they thought by using something other than the blank page. And they got so invested in it that we decided, well, maybe one semester isn't enough. Let's keep going. So these PhD students committed a lot of curricular real estate to continuing that process. So we didn't do just another semester. We did another 2 semesters. So in total, we did 1.5 years of intensive film theory, serious history of both the mainstream film industry and ethnographic and experimental film histories. And what we thought, and I still think, was a pretty serious boot camp in substantive film production. Right? So they had to learn how to make films, and we were going to be pretty strict with ourselves about our commitment to virtuosity on that front. Because one of the things we had argued was that, you know, there's a long history of anthropologists making films, but there's also, I think, a long history of anthropologists making bad films, or at least not taking the idea of filmmaking as seriously as we take the journal article, right? That there's almost a kind of cavalier casualness about film because it doesn't mean the same thing as a journal article. And so we wanted to kind of place them on a similar setting. And we wanted to talk to other filmmakers who were academics about how they thought about their relationship. So we spent that year not just doing this work ourselves, but bringing in filmmakers, some of whom are canonized and folks we know very well. Others we didn't know at all. When we hit the road, we tried to engage people who we thought were doing the kind of work that was informing our decision. I remember one of the things, and this goes a little bit further back, that I'll never forget, was being on a panel with the person I think is one of the most important American documentary filmmakers of all time that too few people watch, who's Fred Wiseman. And I remember Fred Wiseman spent a long time in this panel. And if you ever seen a Fred Wiseman film, he does these very long form observational films. You know, we say very ethnographic films, right? There are no talking heads here. He's going to stay with the community for a long time. And in this panel, what he told everyone was that he would assemble the people who would be in his film. So he'd do films on institutions. He's famous for a film on a housing project, or you know, films on an insane asylum, films on a welfare office. And he would gather the people he would be working with and tell them in no uncertain terms, you know, for 6 months, for a year, for 3 months, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be everywhere. I'm going to be in your face, and it's going to be very intimate. But when I'm done, I'm done. I'm moving on, and I'm going to make my film, right? And so I want to try as best as I can to make sure you all know the difference, or the importance of recognizing that this intensive intimacy we cultivate as filmmakers shouldn't be mistaken for any kind of long-term investment. I'm going to move on. I'm a filmmaker. And I always felt like there was something so refreshingly honest about that. It wasn't the same approach I had learned to take as an ethnographer, right? For me, especially on the first project in Harlem in New York, if the folks I had worked with had thought my interaction with them, my connection to them, my intimate relationships with them could be summed up in the first book that I published, Harlem World, which I was very excited to show them when it was out. See, I told you I was really going to make this book, and it's done. It's in this cover, which they thought was fantastic. But they would have felt violated if it was really simply about the work. And I always feel like that's a complicated way to do it. It's the only way I can do ethnography, almost kind of blurring the lines between friendship and ethnographic research. We can talk about the ethics of that. But there was something so clear and explicit in Fred Wiseman's description of how he tried to explain people his approach to this intensive filmmaking. And then the other thing he said was that his films weren't political, right? That folks are imbuing his films with their assumptions about how the political order should be. Now, on that second point, if you've ever seen a Fred Wiseman film, I think you'd have said there's no way that is true, right? That is BS, that's nonsense. I mean, not completely nonsense. Clearly, we project onto any of these screens images what we come to the films with. But there's a version of us trying to think about the role of the political in this work that's also important, that the field of anthropology is still grappling with, some of which is generational, but not all of it. And so we brought in all these folks who had very different approaches. So some filmmakers like Mitch Denier, a sociological ethnographer, just teamed up with filmmakers. We had folks like Jay Ruby who, used the oldest equipment. These weren't red cameras, right? This was work that almost seemed like, it was an ode to a bygone era of filmmaking, with a very strict approach to what counts as real ethnographic film and what isn't ethnographic film. We had folks who really cared about high production values, others who didn't. And again, our job wasn't to be doctrinaire about it, right? We didn't have a pen approach to this stuff, but we wanted the students to know that you have a ton of options, and your job is to figure out what, if anything, working in images and sound can add to your repertoire as a theorist, as an ethnographer, as you work through your own respective material. And so for us, that was important. Now, we were doing this in conversation and still trying to be in conversation with other important institutional spaces in the US doing this kind of work. And so we would have people like Faye Ginsburg come in and talk about their work at NYU. And I know for Faye Ginsburg, one of the things we read everyone's work, we looked at their films. One of the things she was really keen on was getting the students to recognize that there's a risk in putting all of your time and energy in filmmaking as a student when the academic job market is still going to be looking for published articles, right? That the coin of the realm is still that. And so she was very purposeful about saying, well, it's great to get them through. It's great to get this incorporated into their graduate education, but are they going to be able to have enough on their CVs that are intelligible to folks who don't do this work for them to get the job? So the students kept thinking about that as well, but we pressed on and we continued to really try to think about how do we do this work in a way that actually has teeth, in a way that allows them to feel less fettered than they otherwise might. And so ultimately what ended up happening after that year and a half is the students kind of caught the bug of filmmaking and tried to begin to find ways of institutionalizing it into other things we were doing on campus. So they would have monthly labs where they brought in other kinds of media makers. They started the annual Camera Screening Scholarship Media Festival, where every year we had activists, we had artists, we had academics who worked in all these different modalities. We extended beyond film at one point to audio, to dance, to just trying to think about ways of expanding our notion of what scholarship is and what forms it can take, and coming together constantly to work with one another on projects. To the point where, at one point, we were really trying to figure out, well, how do we convince the folks in the department who are so skeptical, right? And there's skepticism for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, Thin Description, is a certain kind of maybe unfair critique of how Clifford Geertz, pulling this work from Gilbert Ryle, talks about thinness. And he goes to this, and folks probably remember the example, it's this idea of the not being able to tell by just looking, right? Looking with an eye or looking with a film camera, the difference between, say, a wink and a twitch, right? Or a wink that's a parody of a wink, right? There are all these different ways in which the very same action can mean fundamentally different, even diametrically opposed things. And part of the point that Ryle makes, part of the point that Clifford Geertz runs with in Thick Description, is that it's not enough to see it. It's not enough to simply turn a camera on and think the meeting comes out of the performance, right? The classic film, The Axe Fight, is probably the best example of an attempt by filmmakers to really operationalize that idea, right? So if you remember The Axe Fight, we have 3 different versions of the same story. The first one, it's just images and sound. And the point is you have no idea what's going on, right? Second one, you have a little bit more context. But what you really need, of course, is the anthropological expert to come in and tell you what you can't see, right? And there's a version of that that's one of the ways in which I think we can imagine the value placed, and again, you don't have to be a Geertzian scholar to imagine there is something that feels incomplete about imagining you can get enough simply by turning a camera on and pretending interpretation away, pretending contextualization away. But part of what we were trying to argue and think through as a group of scholars committed to trying to find different ways of incorporating this work into our scholarship is actually the point might be the opposite of that one, right? So the reason why there might be such hostility to doing this kind of work isn't because of its thinness, isn't because, you know, it doesn't tell you enough, but because anytime you look at an image, no matter what the image is, even the filmmaker, him or her or themselves, lose control in a sense over what the audience sees and how they see, right? That it's so rife with possibilities for meetings, things at the edges and corners of the frame, things that you might focus on that you might otherwise, like, so for instance, if you were to just, you know, put someone's face on the screen now, who's not, if you could put my face on, it's fine, but someone else who's not talking, right? Just put, you know, any random face and make that the main face you see. Part of what you recognize is, you know, even the most masterful author, the most masterful novelist or poet who can give you detail, give you all of this nuance, right? And how you represent a person or an affect or an attitude, they won't be able to necessarily get to you as you watch a screen, all the things you might imagine you'd focus on. Looking at just a straight image of someone's face, listening to some academic rattle on about his academic career. And the reason why that is, I would think, is because there's so much you can do there. And we can look at our writing and see that this is true. We're trained to try to rope in our audience, right? We're trained to confine them, to lock them into our reading of the material, right? Which is why we're not redundant, right? We say the same thing over and over and again on purpose, because we want to make sure it's not misused or misinterpreted, right? And we can see the value of that, right? We know all these anthropological theories that get mistranslated, we would argue, into policies and practices that are very different from maybe what the anthropologists who came up with them or the social scientists who tried to make sense of these phenomena would have imagined. And so we want to lock the reader. We want to lock the audience in. This is it and no more. And there's a version, I think, of what the film camera represents. No matter how many talking heads you might put on to explain something, no matter what techniques you might use, no matter how purposeful you are in designing, composing your shot, there's always something the viewer will see that you didn't anticipate. You didn't probably even see yourself as a filmmaker, and that gives them an out, gives them an escape hatch. And there's something, I think, for an academic trained to write in such a constrained way that terrorizes us about when we think about that. And that is, to me, one version of what there's. We read a little bit of Barth as well, and we try to play with the extent to which, you know, Barth's idea about the difference between the studium and the punctum could be translatable to film. But even if it's not, there is something I think he holds on to and is really perceptive on about just how affectively laden the images can be. And it's that, the power of affect, that to me is the grounding principle here. And I'll start to close up now, but there's, we always quote W.B. Du Bois. How does it feel to be a problem is a version of what Du Bois offers up. And for social scientists, our emphasis is on the second half of that question, right? The problem half, right? How do you operationalize the problem and define it? Is there some way to measure the extent of the problem? Of course, how do you fix the problem? What policies do you use? But I think the first half of that, how does it feel, is a version, even as a sociologist, he was very perceptive to trying to understand. And this idea of feeling, of affect, is something that clearly we can capture in writing if we wanted to. But I would argue it's almost impossible not to imbue in images, even against our attempts to drain them of some of that power and affect. So you know, we spent a year and a half, again, we don't all agree on this, and even my ideas about what's possible and what's not change over time. But cut to 2015 or so, and one of my PhD students at Annenberg, who actually predates a lot of the students who were in the camera cohort, became the first student in the history of the University of Pennsylvania who graduated with an all-film dissertation. Had never happened before. And it took a lot of work, a lot of white papers, a lot of talking to deans. And it isn't inconsequential that this was a student of color who would not have come to the University of Pennsylvania were she not able to do this work. And when you look at the group of students, now we've probably had about 40 students or so come through, we call it camera, come through the camera process with us. To Faye Ginsburg's point, the folks who got graduated have gotten jobs and are actually reproducing the model and teaching anthropology and film to undergrads and grads all throughout the US, overseas at Goldsmith and other places. So they've gotten their positions. It actually became quite lucrative to be able to do the work that they do. But you'll find it's also the most diverse group of students, PhD students at the University of Pennsylvania, both in the leadership and the rank and file members. So when you come to the annual Screening Scholarship Media Festival every spring semester, you will not see a space more diverse in every single way you would imagine. And to me, that's not trivial and it's not accidental. Because part of what it represents, I think, is this idea of saying, well, if you're going to be serious about diversity, it's not enough to invoke the word. How do you create an academic and intellectual environment where students can see what you're doing and say, I can imagine myself and the kinds of things I care about being supported, protected, and cultivated in that space. Right? So for me, it was filmmaking, right? And so I had to do my filmmaking under the cover of darkness, but these were PhD students from several different schools across campus saying filmmaking, media making, or dance was constitutive of their scholarly identities. Not something on the side, not something to be pretended away, but essential to their intervention in the academy. And to me, that's a sea change, right? Going from not quite feeling comfortable that people would take me seriously as a filmmaking grad student, to folks saying, this is what we do. It's important other people recognize the value of what we do. And then as icing on the top of that cake, at least so far, being able to go out into the market and get other institutions to take seriously what they'll contribute. And so for me, that is significant. And it's an investment in diversity that we never talk about diversity. We just do it. And we do it because we open up spaces where students can say, you know what, I have an idea and I care about this. And I want to engage the world in these ways. And we say, let's figure out how we help you do that. And I think there's a version of experimental ethnography or creative or imaginative ethnography that should be about the business of opening up spaces for people to completely reconceptualize what knowledge looks like, how we engage with one another, what form intellectual activity takes. And if we do that, trust me, diversity will handle itself. And for me, that is, and there's a reason why I think, and hopefully when some of you all can get to the next Screening Scholarship Festival, maybe in 2021, maybe in 2022, you'll see what I'm talking about. And it makes me so proud, so excited that the students have found enough confidence in themselves. And this is really, you know, I pretend to take credit. I get no credit for this. This is really all student run. They've done a fantastic job of saying, this is what the academy I want to be a part of should look like. And so I'll end there and say thank you for letting me tell you a little bit about why I'm so excited about the kind of work you all are doing, about the stuff we're trying to do at Penn. And hopefully we can have a good conversation for a little bit about what I left out. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was really great. A big applause, I think, from everybody who's listening in here today. So just to let everybody know who's joined late, that at this point we will now be turning the recording off. So the rest of the conversation is not being recorded. Now we were going to